This lecture provides an extensive analysis of the short story The Aleph by Luis Borges. The discussion would explore the narrative structure, the key plot developments, and the central theme, including the exploration of infinity, the nature of memory, and the interplay between finite and the infinite. Now, Borges trademarked literary techniques, including metafiction, intertextuality, and other philosophical inquiries. They all form a rich tapestry that invites careful scholarly reflection other than or apart from a detailed classroom discussion. Now, the Aleph tells the story of a narrator who is both deeply affected by personal tragedy and intellectually fascinated by the nature of the universe. The text revolves around his recollections of a dear love who's lost, who is dead now, basically, whose name is Beatrice, and the narrator's subsequent encounter with a neighbor, come her lover, Beatrice's lover, called Carlos Argentino Daneri. Now, Daenerys claims to have discovered an extraordinary point in space, a point that he calls the Aleph, from which one can perceive the entirety of the universe simultaneously, becomes the bedrock, becomes the main motive or the plot of this entire short story. This seemingly fantastical discovery, it rather sets the stage for a narrative that blends personal memory with the ambition of capturing the infinite. Now, the story is framed as a first-person narrative in which the narrator, the unnamed narrator, he reflects on his past and the events surrounding Daenerys' claim. Early in the narrative, we find that he recounts the deep sense of loss and disorientation that was followed by Beatrice's death. Her memory, in a way, haunts him, and the longing for her presence transforms into a broader yearning to comprehend all of existence. It is precisely this emotional and intellectual backdrop that primes him for the experience of the Aleph, a moment where the boundaries between time, space, and memory collapse. Now, the narrative takes an intriguing turn when the narrator visits the modest home of Carlos Argentino Daneri. Daneri is a man of considerable literary pretensions, one can say, and has a compulsive desire to capture the totality of experience through his writing, as he claims that his basement basically and primarily conceals a miracle, a tiny, almost imperceptible point in which the entire universe is visible. Now, this point, which he unassumingly calls the Aleph, is portrayed as a portal to infinity. It is in this single, all-encompassing vision that the complexities and the minutiae of the world, in a way, converge into a singular experience that defies conventional modes of perception and appreciation. Throughout the story, Borges uses descriptions that evoke a sense of overwhelming simultaneity. When the narrator gazes into this object, into this mysterious, rather mystical object, the Aleph, he experiences a dazzling vision in which every place in the world is revealed at once. Here, the narrative grapples with the notion of infinity, an inexhaustible continuum where every temporal and spatial detail coexists. Now, this experience is both profoundly beautiful and disorientingly overwhelming, where it hints the limitation of human understanding when confronted with something which is as elusive and boundless as infinity. Borges not only invites the readers to contemplate the paradoxes that are inherent in such an encounter. One can read through the entire passage dedicated to the description of the Aleph, and one finds that there are intricate kind of contradictions and paradoxes that exist with this kind of encounter, but there are also challenges that question the nature of representation, memory, and the reliability of perception. Now, as the story unfolds, the narrative gradually shifts from a personal meditation on loss and remembrance to a broader exploration of cosmic themes. Borges, who is usually known for his philosophical inquiries, something which is wrapped in fantastical narratives, uses this encounter with the Aleph as a metaphor to simply capture an all-encompassing image of the universe. This metaphor is particularly significant in the context of literary modernism, where the fragmented nature of experience and the simultaneous multiplicity of meaning, they all expose the limitations of linear narrative structures. In confronting the absurdity of trying to capture this complexity, this infinite complexity within the confines of language and memory, Borges reflects the nature of human endeavor itself. And that's how the story contains and takes up a meta-literary dimension. The narrator's reflection on his own writing and his admiration for the literary possibilities embedded in Carlos Verbos' attempts, Daenerys Verbos' writing attempts to describe the Aleph, it reveals Borges' preoccupation with the act of narrative creation itself. Borges plays with the idea that the act of description is inherently reductive. That is, any attempt to articulate the infinite in limited finite terms is doomed to fail. However, in a very beautifully paradoxical fashion, this failure becomes a source for creative inspiration. Now, one of the core themes in the Aleph is the interplay between the finite and the infinite. On the one level, the narrator grapples with the finite nature of human life and memory, the effervescence of Beatrice's presence, the inevitability of loss, the fleeting nature of individual moments. They all are underscored by his personal reflections. And on another level, the Aleph serves as a symbol of infinity itself. How? An unbounded collection of all experiences, events, spatial realities that coexist in a single moment of profound revelation. Borges masterfully juxtaposes these two contrasting realities, encouraging readers to reflect on how finite human experiences can be and can occasionally be brushed against the infinite. Equally important is the theme of memory and its capacity to both preserve and distort reality. The narrator's recollection of Beatrice is both laced with love and grief. It exemplifies that intricate relationship between memory and identity. Borges seems to suggest that memory, much like this object, the Aleph itself, is a repository of both the particular and the universal. The act of remembering is portrayed as an attempt to anchor oneself in an ever-shifting reality while simultaneously reaching out towards the finite. The Aleph, therefore, in a way, becomes a metaphor that not only stands for some sort of universal truth, but also for the elusive nature of human recollection. Now, another aspect of the narrative is in its exploration of the limits of human perception. Borges is particularly interested in how subjective experience shape our understanding of reality. The narrator's experience of the Aleph, with its overwhelming flood of images, sensations, they all highlight the fragility of human cognition, human cerebration, of course, when faced with an enormity that defies logical categorization. The innumerable and the fine details that rush in at once force the reader to confront the limitations inherent in an attempt to completely comprehend an object. In doing so, Borges subtly critiques the hubris of those who believe that human consciousness can fully encapsulate the entire working of the cosmos. Now, the stylistic approach that Louis Borges employed in the Aleph employs in the Aleph is an important element as its thematic concerns as well. And why? Because his language that we find in the Aleph is measured, is reflective, and it is imbued with intellectual rigor and a clear sense of irony that runs through the entire narrative. Borges' prose, which kind of blends the concrete with the abstract, it serves to draw attention to the inherent contradictions and paradoxes in any attempt to articulate the idea of what infinity is. And this duality, in a way, the struggle between the tangible world and the abstract notion of infinity, lies at the heart of the story and is skillfully rendered through a narrative that is both lucid and multi-layered. A further dimension of the narrative that might not be very blatant, but it is more like a self-reflexive commentary on literature and the act of writing itself, had been how Carlos' tedious and pompous descriptions, it contrasts sharply with the narrator's incisive yet resigned insights. While Carlos appears obsessively with using language as a means of cataloging the infinite details of the universe, the narrator remains skeptical of any claims of total comprehension. So, for the narrator, then language is highly unstable and insufficient. There's always this tension that we find in the entire narrative between the verbose, the unchecked ambition and cautious, thoughtful observations that mirrors Borges' own ambivalence towards literary modernity. He acknowledges the potential of language to evoke the sublime, yet he also exposes its inevitable inadequacies when tasked with encompassing the idea of infinity. So we find that the Aleph, and rather throughout the Aleph, Borges leaves his narrative open to a multiple interpretations, where on the surface it can be read as a straightforward recounting of some mystical experience, and a deeper reading reveals layers of meaning that invite sort of constant reinterpretation. So the narrative in the Aleph is not merely a scientific or some sort of mystical rediscovery of phenomena. It is also a repository of all art, all history, and all memory. In this sense, it also stands for a symbol for the vast reservoir of human knowledge and the creative endeavor, a challenge to anyone who attempts to encapsulate the idea of totality within the limited constraints of language and time. Throughout the narrative, we find there is a relentless questioning of the relationship between the finite and the infinite, and it is as much an inquiry into the nature of existence, almost an epistemological nature of existence, as it is into the art of storytelling. The juxtaposition of personal loss and the cosmic revelation, they provide a potent framework for discussing how literature can mediate between intimate human experiences and the vast and often unfathomable dimensions of reality. One may also dwell, of course, in the classroom discussions and, of course, in writing as well, on how Borges intentionally blurs the boundaries between fiction and reality. The narrator's reflection on his own authorship and the challenge of adequately representing the world, it hints at a broader philosophical skepticism toward objective truth. And this indeterminacy is central to much of Borges' work, and the Aleph is no exception. Moreover, the narrative also very subtly and slightly too interrogates the nature of ambition and the pitfalls of human enterprise. Carlos Deneri's grandiose literary projects, which tries to describe the universe in all its complexity, they all serve to critique the tendency to oversimplify or rather misrepresent reality. Borges appears to warn against the allure of totalizing systems of thought, suggesting that the very act of attempting to master infinite detail can lead to a form of intellectual paralysis. In this light in this sense, the story can also be read as a meditation on the limits, both epistemological limits and the practical limits of human endeavors to fathom the universe. Now, throughout the text, Louis Borges employs a number of rich symbolic elements. Rich symbolism is that what it exists in the text, and they are layered allusions that resonate with a wide spectrum of philosophical and literary traditions. There are references to mystical and religious concepts that are interwoven with the themes from mathematics and philosophy, and thus it almost creates a mosaic like sort of intellectual inquiry into the epistemes of various epistemes of knowledge. For example, the Aleph in itself is reminiscent of mystical visions found in various religious traditions, where the encounter with the divine is both transformative and ineffable. Simultaneously, the idea of infinity, it recalls the counterintuitive nature of modern mathematical thought, challenging the notion that human cognition, human brain, can somehow encapsulate boundlessness. Now, amid this analysis, it is also crucial to consider why this had been the case or the broader cultural and historical context in which Borges was writing. And amidst the backdrop of early 20th century, literary innovation and existential philosophy serves much to the service of Borges' work. Borges' work reflects a collective grappling with modernity's uncertainties. His blending of whimsical narrative elements with rigorous philosophical inquiry, it all mirrors a period in which traditional narratives were being questioned and the boundaries of literary forms were being redrawn. Thus, the Aleph can be seen not just as a personal meditation on loss and memory, but also as a sort of reflection of the transformative power, of the transformativeness of the intellectual currents of its time. The narrator, in a way, brushes with trying to, create this conflict with the idea of infinite in the form of the Aleph that overall stands as a metaphor for the ceaseless human quest for meaning in a world that is at once so vast and elusive. And this tension that we find in what can be seen versus what can be remembered versus what can be written down versus what lies beyond the human comprehension remains a central paradox in the entire narrative. This dynamic tension, it also encourages us to, in a way, accept the mysteries of the universe that might not be completely or fully resolved. And in a way, also reflecting the beauty of literature that often lies in its power to evoke wonder and contemplation rather than to offer concrete solutions. Next, I'd like to, as an important final point of reflection, and of course, other than that, there would be elements of phenomenological readings too. So next, I'd like to highlight the important next part of how the Aleph can also be interpreted through a phenomenological lens. Why? Because those who are reading this work, it is essential to understand and analyze and rather emphasize the Aleph not simply as a fantastical tale of some cosmic vision, rather it is a carefully constructed exploration of how literature can capture the fleeting glimpses of an infinite reality. And using the phenomenological lens, now phenomenology, the Aleph as a phenomenon of consciousness, phenomenology in itself holds that consciousness is always intentional. It is always consciousness of something. Now, the Aleph is not merely an object, it is an event of consciousness too. How? When the narrator sees the Aleph, he experiences all space and all time simultaneously. Now, this is a phenomenological impossibility under any ordinary condition. Why? Because experience is usually horizontal. We only ever grasp a part of a phenomena, with the rest of it is implied. But in the Aleph, this horizon in a way collapses. The Aleph transcends the normal temporal and spatial experience. The narrator says he saw the teeming sea, the dawn, the dawn and the dusk, the crowds of, the crowds of America, silvery cobweb in the center of a black pyramid, the circulation of my own dark blood. Now, this very moment, it abolishes the temporal flow of lived experience, that life and the number of experiences do not occur systematically after every moment, time by time, in past, present, and future. They do not occur in that fashion. Rather, they create an impossible simultaneity, a phenomenological saturation where intuition exceeds intentional grasp. They appear and exist at the same time, simultaneously, and this simultaneity is what is important to, is intentional to the understanding of the Aleph. Then Jean-Luc Marion's concept of the idea of phenomenon, that is saturated phenomenon, it also helps clarify the story, the Aleph. How? A saturated phenomena is one where the intuitive content, it exceeds the capacity of conceptualization or its reduction. Now, what does this mean? This simply means that the Aleph as an object, it overwhelms the narrator givenness. Givenness, his ability to take in, to synthesize, to make sense of what he just now experienced, or to very much reduce the experience into some sort of current meaning. The narrator says, what my eyes beheld were simultaneous, what I shall now write is successive, because language in itself is successive. So the Aleph is not fully representable, it's not fully graspable, which in a way also aligns with Marion's idea that some phenomena give themselves in excess, in so much excess that beyond what consciousness can rather grasp or articulate is almost like an impossibility. Then phenomenology also focuses on the relationship between the act of consciousness and the object as it is intended. Now, one act of consciousness is called meiosis, and the object as it is intended is called nous. Now, in the Aleph, this relation somehow breaks down. What relation? The act of consciousness, the very act of experiencing the Aleph in its totality versus the object as it is intended. What range of experiences the Aleph is supposed to, not the Aleph, the narrator that is supposed to reflect upon through writing is in itself limited. So the narrator's act of seeing, experiencing, cannot fully constitute the totality of what he perceives as the object as it is intended. So in a way, noema, N-O-E-M-A, it overflows and it cannot fully be synthesized or held together. And this creates a crisis of meaning where experience becomes too rich, too large, too enormous to be processed through something called language. Then other than that, there are, of course, temporal disruptions that take place with the experience of the Aleph, the loss of worldhood, as Heidegger very popularly would say. And in Heideggerian kind of phenomenology, human experience is fundamentally being in the world. It is always situated, it is always finite, it is always temporal. And of course, we find the Aleph disrupts these structures. The narrator says that the Aleph as an object ruptures this very systematic disintegration of the world, rather integration of the world, which is into certain finite and temporal realities. So with the experience of the Aleph, the narrator's temporality is broken. He sees past, present, and future all at once. He is no longer in time, but a condition that defies this very normal temporal unfolding. His being in the world is destabilized. He no longer has a clear place, perspective, or orientation. The Aleph disorients and, in a way, also decontextualizes the narrator. The object may even threaten its, the narrator's authenticity, in Heidegger's terms, by replacing his situated experience with a totally inhuman totality. Now, to see the Aleph might require a kind of epoche. Now, epoche is more like the suspension of the natural attitude and a key methodological step in Husserl's phenomenology. Now, Husserl's phenomenology, but the Aleph also represents some sort of limit experience that also escapes the idea of reduction. The Aleph, in this sense, it resists these eidetic variation. There is no typical essence of the Aleph that can be grasped through imaginative variation. And in this sense, um, a non-phenomenal because it overwhelms all conditions of phenomenology occurs and takes place. So we find that if phenomenology relies on coherent appearances to consciousness, the Aleph demonstrates what happens when that coherence collapses under the weight of infinite givenness. So from this phenomenological perspective, the Aleph is not merely a mystical object, but a radical challenge to the structure of consciousness and experience as well. The Aleph saturates perception, it destabilizes temporality, and it also intentionally defies all ideas of intentionality. It reveals the limits of human finitude, the instability of perspective, and the inadequacy of language. Ultimately, it may not seem in the ordinary sense, but it is perhaps best understood as a phenomenological impossibility that Borges has rendered thinkable through fiction. So, to summarize or to conclude, one can say that the Aleph offers a rich and layered narrative in which personal grief intermingles with cosmic mystery, while the narrative structure and the multifaceted kind of experience of its protagonist, it leads to an exploration of themes such as inexhaustible nature of infinity, the bittersweet interplay between memory and oblivion, and the limits of human capacity to describe the totality of existence. For this reason, we find that the Aleph is essential if one has to take into account Borges' narrative and overall how his narrative is not a closed system with some sort of neat answers. It is instead a live conversation, a living conversation, one where the interplay between theory and experience, between the finite and the infinite, continues to inspire the debates and reflections. And that is why the Aleph stands as a remarkable piece of literature that transcends the boundary of genre and discipline. Of course, because of its rich thematic content, because of its innovative narrative perspective, the profound exploration of how literature can also serve as a medium for understanding the paradoxes of cosmos, the paradoxes of existence, of the universe. And that is why through the very, and the Aleph has an enduring power of storytelling, a story that captures the imagination while simultaneously also challenging us, the readers, to confront the limits of knowledge and the vast uncharted territories of infinity. Thank you very much.